Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Marcia Eli from the Brooklyn Public Library's Center for Brooklyn History and the Arts and Culture team BPL Presents. This year, Brooklyn Public Library celebrates its 125th anniversary. Our first branch opened in 1896, and now 125 years later, 61 branches cross the borough. This birthday provides an opportunity to celebrate all that the library does. And one important part of that work is stewarding the extraordinary special collections at the Center for Brooklyn History. These archives are the combined materials that come from BPL and the former Brooklyn Historical Society, and they are literally the most comprehensive collection of Brooklyn-related materials in the world. 33,000 books, 1,200 oral histories, 50,000 photographs, 2,000 maps, and on and on. So we're celebrating this amazing collection. And in this 125th anniversary series, we have a program series called Out of the Box. And in it, we are putting the archive center stage with guest historians and experts who peek into just some of the many, many stories that they tell. Tonight's program kicks us off. And I hope you'll explore the rest of the series, which brings to our stage experts like Michael Kimmelman, the architectural critic for the New York Times, urban planner Ron Schiffman, Brooklyn Dodgers historian Peter Gollenbach, sports writer Bill Roden, civil rights experts and historians Brian Purnell and Mike Woodworth, and many, many others. And you can check out all of the programs by going to the link in the chat. So for the kickoff, and apropos of our birthday, we're looking at Brooklyn in the year that BPL was born. And I'm very excited that we'll be joined by two distinguished historians who you will hear about in a little bit. They'll be led in conversation by Michelle Montalbano, who only recently, and very sadly for us, left the Center for Brooklyn History, where her work as a librarian included reference services, programming, and exhibitions. I'm really happy for this excuse to get her back, at least for the night. And before I turn it over to her, I want to give you all two quick notes. First, you have the option to use closed captioning tonight. There's a button to click live transcript at the bottom of your screen. And second, please share your questions with us tonight. Type those into the Q&A box, which is also an icon on your screen. And with that, Michelle, it's my pleasure to hand it off to you.
Thank you so much for that great introduction, Marcia, and thank you to everyone who's joining us here tonight to celebrate Brooklyn Public Library's 125th anniversary. Early Brooklyn library history would not be complete without beginning with a discussion of the movement from subscription libraries, privately held libraries, and athenaeums into large integrated public library systems. What you're seeing here is a range of material types from our collection. This is an annual report from 1896, the year in question, and it illustrates the point perfectly that the library has received since last report for 410 donors, 940 volumes, 702 pamphlets, and 3,640 numbers of periodicals. We also have an annual report from 1898 here that gives an overview of the library's early history, which, as Marcia mentioned, began in 1896 with the funding of the Bedford branch of the library at a different location from the Carnegie branch that replaced it. And I will share pictures of those early branches in just a moment, but you'll see here that the first election of officers was held on the 23rd December 1857. The directors were chosen on these committees, and then there were luminaries from the time, including Reverend R.S. Storrs, Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, and others. most important in talking about early library history is a discussion of Andrew Carnegie, who is both a ruthless titan of industry and a philanthropist noted for funding over 20 branches of the Brooklyn Public Library system alone, as well as the branches in the rest of the country. The agreement here is from 1901, which lays out that he will provide funds for building a number of BPL branches, including the Williamsburg branch, which in cornerstone laying materials here, and I'll go back to those earlier slides, is lauded as the first of the Carnegie branches. In fact, the first Carnegie branch was the Pacific branch, which opened in 1904. The Carnegie branch here did not open until 1905, but the cornerstone laying ceremonies were given much aplomb in the newspapers. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle article gave it a great deal of press. This quotation here also illustrates really important points about early library history in Brooklyn. They're not new in our country, but the methods of library work have greatly changed and greatly improved in recent years. The new policy requires that the advantages of the public library shall be brought as near as possible to the doors of our citizens, and that the library, like our schools, shall be daily educational influence, not for the scholar or the student alone, but for every class and condition of our people. This too demonstrates the notion of noblesse oblige, which motivated a great deal of the philanthropy in the Gilded Age, which is, of course, not necessarily purely or altruistically motivated. There is an element of social control and the edifying of the great unwashed masses that was intrinsic in that approach to philanthropy. This is an image from 1897 of the first branch in Brooklyn Public Library's system. 1897 is when it finally opened on Bedford Avenue in the old PS3. Again, there is a new branch that opened in 1905, funded by Andrew Carnegie. An earlier version of the Williamsburg branch here, and these images are from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, as well as the Brooklyn Daily Eagle morgue. And finally, there are some matching images here, which I found really interesting from the cornerstone laying ceremony and the way that the plan for the Williamsburg branch was shared in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle at the time. It was designed in a classical revival style, and its floor plan was meant to evoke an open book with 2 wings radiating from the center atrium. And those of you familiar with the floor plan of Central Library will recognize that there is a trademark there. And with that, I will move things over to the rest of our discussion with our 2 distinguished historians, Prithi Kanakamedala and Thomas Campanella. Thomas J. Campanella is a professor of city planning at Cornell University and a historian in residence of the NYC Parks Department. He is a recipient of Guggenheim, Fulbright, and Rome Prize fellowships and has held visiting appointments at Columbia, Harvard, and MIT. His books include Brooklyn, the Once and Future City, The Concrete Dragon, and Republic of Shade. Winner of the Spiro Kostoff Award, Tom has written for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, The New Yorker, Slate, and New York Magazine. He divides his time between Ithaca and the Brooklyn neighborhood where he grew up. And Prithi Kanakamedala is an associate professor in history at Bronx Community College and the MALS program at the Graduate Center of CUNY. Her research interests include archives, material culture, and 19th century free Black communities in Brooklyn and New York. She previously served as a historian for In Pursuit of Freedom and curator for Brooklyn Abolitionists, a partnership of Brooklyn Historical Society, now the Center for Brooklyn History, Weeksville Heritage Center, and Irondale Ensemble Project. Welcome, Tom and Prithi. Thank you so much for joining us here. So the first question I want to ask to really get the ball rolling in this discussion is to paint a picture of what life was really like for Brooklyn citizens in 1896. One of the elements of both of your work that I really admire is that you tell a complicated and critical version of history. You don't necessarily privilege the events or the interpretive modes that all historians use. And I want to give voice using materials in our collections and some help from some other collections to the lived experiences of all Brooklynites and all neighborhoods. Tom, would you like to start by helping us paint that picture?
Sure. Well, it's a Brooklyn. Thank you, incidentally, for inviting me and introducing me. And it's good to be with a group in Brooklyn, even if I am here in a very far-flung borough of Brooklyn, as many people would have it, in Ithaca, New York. The last decade of the 19th century was a very intensely, a very important one in Brooklyn history. It really, as you all know, was the last decade of its full independence as a city, previously a collection of villages and towns. It was a place of with a I would say a fierce independent spirit, a fierce sense of itself, but also at the same time fully cognizant of its dependency status on New York, which is of course what we refer to as Manhattan now. It would never, Brooklyn would never have existed really without Manhattan. It wouldn't have grown as much. You could also say accurately that Manhattan needed Brooklyn as well, right? Frederick Law Olmsted described Manhattan as in the condition of a walled town or walled city. It had no hinterland, and Brooklyn really was its hinterland. It was also a place where you had intensive urban development, but also an enormous amount of rural countryside and agricultural land, right? If we can maybe pull up that computer rendering of, there's a drawing here that appeared in my book that this is it here. Now, this is an image with the elevation a bit exaggerated. It isn't the orange hill line of hills there is not as quite as rugged as that, but that is the terminal moraine, right? You all know that the glacier, the last period of glaciation, played a very large role in shaping the Northeast, New York State certainly, but also New York City. The glacier extended twice down to the vicinity of modern day New York, basically looked around and called it quits, backed up into the, toward Canada, but left behind this pile of crap that we call Long Island. And the high spine there is the terminal moraine in orange. The reason I'm showing this is the little purple patches shows urbanization and development. And you could see that prior to the basically till the 1920s, most of the development was on the north side of the terminal moraine, right? It doesn't spill over onto the south side and race to the sea until the great 1920s building boom. The only exception there is Coney Island, which we can talk about later. If Manhattan, New York, began in the south, right, at the Battery and grew north, Brooklyn basically reversed the polarity of New York and began at the East River and developed south. So all this land you see on the right side of that image is essentially agricultural land, right? Or on the verge of selected discrete suburban developments. Brooklyn at this time also had a pretty extraordinary infrastructure, right? Maybe you can go to this image of the map with Prospect Park. Yeah, so you all know that Prospect Park was built right out in the wake of in the aftermath of the Civil War. This is really the crown jewel of the Olmsted Vaux legacy. It was they considered it their finest work. It was a point of pride that Brooklyn possessed this masterpiece and a park that in many ways is superior as an example of this neo-Anglo romantic design style than Central Park. In addition, if you could go to the slide of of Ocean Parkway or Eastern Parkway. No, there's a plan view with the trees. What's extraordinary is one more. Yeah, what's really extraordinary about Prospect Park is it's here in Brooklyn that Olmsted had a chance to realize this vision of an integrated regional or metropolitan greenway system, right? This was not something that was realized in New York with Central Park, but what he does here is lay out this extraordinary network or matrix of parkways, right? This is an image here of Eastern Parkway showing it's very much based on the Parisian avenues, the Parisian boulevards, right? And if you could go to the next slide, this is what they look like, right? And I've described these as the longest elm streets in America because Olmsted, being a Connecticut Yankee, planted these parkways with nothing but that Yankee standard, the American elm, which was not planted extensively in New York City before. Go to the next slide and we can see how, or the one that shows there's a green, yeah. Now you can see here, the large green blob at the top of the slide is Prospect Park, and you can see how he drew out these tendrils of green to link up south to Coney Island and the beach, right? That's Ocean Parkway. East to a chain of parks and cemeteries along the terminal moraine on the edge of Queens. And then on the left side of the image, that is Fort Hamilton Parkway, which exists. I'm sure many of you know it, but not as a parkway. Unfortunately, it was never realized in the same way as the others. But that was intended to go and join at the Narrows, right? To connect Prospect Park to the Narrows. And then he even envisioned the Eastern Parkway tendril, the one at the top of the screen, looping all the way back to what was called Blackwell's Island at the time, Roosevelt Island today, and then going across a bridge and eventually tying in to Central Park. So he envisioned this 20-mile loop, right? That was extraordinary. He also had rail infrastructure at this time that was very extensive, right? You can go maybe to that image of the railroads, the rail lines. The railroad system at this time was a kind of a mess. It was all sorts of different companies operating different steam lines. Can you go to the map of the railroads? Operating, yeah, yeah, that's it. And you can get a sense here of the extent of all this. There were elevated steam railroads with steam locomotives. There were street railways that were being, with cars being pulled by horses. And there were these so-called excursion railways. What happens around 1896 is that all of these different companies are consolidated by and into a holding company called the Brooklyn Rapid Transit Company, the BRT, right? The BRT, it no longer exists. It was later transformed into the BMT, which we all know of today, right? So that gives you a general sense of what's going on here. I'd say one other piece of the puzzle here that's very important is all the way down at Coney Island, and now we can go to the last slide. You have an entrepreneur named George C. Tillieu building really what was one of the first amusement parks in the United States, and that's Steeplechase park, the first steeplechase park, which you see here. This is the anchor institution that creates this phenomenon that will soon be known all over the world as Coney Island. This park is destroyed by fire in 1907, but rebuilt bigger and better afterward. Okay, that's a sketch of what Brooklyn looked like from the physical and infrastructure standpoint.
Thank you, Tom. I don't think it's time to take those slides down yet. We do have a few more important points to illustrate with them. Where all of the train lines and parkways, which I mean, it's self-evident upon reflection, but parkways were intended to connect the parkland green space within the borough specifically. We're bringing more and more people together at the time. Eastern Parkway, I think I would like to start by Prithi asking you to talk a bit about Weeksville, right? Black community, a free Black community located in what is now Crown Heights and Bedside. There are many people who lived in Brooklyn who've never heard the stories of Weeksville and James Weeks, who founded it in 1838, right? So that's just 11 years after the abolition of slavery in New York State. So can you talk about the importance of Weeksville to Brooklyn's history and these three amazing women, Marisha Lyons, Sarah J. Garnett, and Susan Smith McKinney Stewart for us?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak tonight. And thank you also to everybody who is logged on. If you're in New York, it's been a particularly muggy day after 2 days of sunshine. So it is lovely to sort of congregate, even if it's virtually. So thinking about a lot of what my esteemed panelist has said about where Brooklyn was at in 1896, and where it had come from, right? Some very sort of humble roots as just one of 6 towns after the American Revolution. By 1834, it's considered a city. And certainly by 1896, if by 1861, it was the 3rd largest city in the United States, when Brooklyn Public Library comes to be in 1896, Brooklyn has blossomed. And in thinking specifically about Weeksville and also just general Black activism and Black Brooklynites in the borough, what we're really looking at is a blossoming, or really sort of like a pinnacle, as it were, of 2 specific themes. The one theme is Black women's activism, which had been in Brooklyn, right? It's part of Brooklyn's history for that entire 19th century. But in looking at these 3 women, you really are looking at, as I said, sort of a golden chapter of Brooklyn's history. On the left is Marisha Lyons. She was born and brought up in Manhattan. She will escape during the 1863 draft riots, go up to Rhode Island. But in the late 19th century, she returns to Brooklyn, not to Manhattan, where a lot of Black New Yorkers did not return, right? That was considered a place of, or a space of trauma, a place that held bad memories of violence. So Marisha, along with many, many Black people, will return, but they will return to Brooklyn in the late 19th century. The woman in the middle, Sarah Smith Tompkins Garnett, daughter of Weeksville. Her father is Sylvanus Smith, who lives in that village of Brooklyn in the early 19th century. And she is an educator in her own right and at the forefront of women's activism in terms of voting rights. She's also one of the many women, along with Marisha, who will invite an unknown at that time, Ida B. Wells, to Brooklyn to speak and to really start to mobilize Black women around the idea of voting. And the third woman on the right is actually Sarah's sister, Susan Smith McKinney Stewart. And those of you who know your Brooklyn history know this, right? The first Black woman to become a doctor in New York State, and the third Black woman doctor in the United States. Again, both daughters of Weeksville, both Sylvanus Smith's daughters. I just like this image because it really is the culmination of 80 to 90 plus years of activism among Black women on the ground amongst its free Black community. And what I mean by that is, if you think about 1821, when the New York State Constitution changes and Black men are fighting for the right to vote because they've introduced a property requirement. You know, you had to own $250 worth of property in order to vote. And Black men are sort of leading that struggle throughout the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. The archives show it is always their wives and daughters who are at the center of that struggle, even though they are not at the forefront of being able to vote themselves. In the 1890s in Brooklyn, what you see then is that sort of renaissance of Black women's activism, in which they are very much front and center this time. There are no silences in the archives, and you will see them fighting for the right to vote. So 1896 is pivotal, not just for Brooklyn Public Library, but because back down in DC, they will form the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. And I believe it's the next slide that's taken from the collections. So although this is an organization in DC that's, again, organizing around Black women and the right to vote, of course, this is way before the 19th Amendment. What you can clearly see from this particular excerpt taken from the library's collections is that Brooklyn in 1896 is still considered important enough to be on the map, right? These women will come and gather at Concord Baptist Church, which of course still exists today. In 1896, as you can clearly see from the clipping, it had not moved to Bedford-Stuyvesant yet. It was in Fort Greene, but it had certainly moved from its roots in the 1840s in downtown Brooklyn. If I could get the next slide, please. And again, thinking about Black women's activism in Brooklyn as having a long history, right? These women did not just emerge sort of out of a vacuum or a void in the 1890s. Thinking about the Civil War and Reconstruction, again, two items from Brooklyn Public Library's collections. One on the left, a Union Fair, right, raising money for the troops during the Civil War. And the one on the right, slightly different from the Freedmen's Society. The one on the right is the American Freedmen's Friends Society. It was a Black-led organization, unlike the Freedmen's Bureau, which was the federal one. James N. Gloucester is the person that's featured here, but actually in our research, we find that it's his wife, Elizabeth Gloucester, who's at the center of the activism. So again, thinking about the three women in the previous slide as actually being not just the daughters of people in terms of genealogy, but actually the recipients of that decade's worth of activism. If I could get the next slide, please. Awesome, thank you. So in 1896, thinking about that through line or that theme about Black women's activism, but another theme of self-determination. Brooklyn, of course, is home, as you know, we started, to Weeksville, the second largest free Black community in pre-Civil War America. It puts Brooklyn on the map for something that is unique in a way that, you know, Seneca Village is raised after 30 years to create Central Park. That free Black community by the 1890s, and of course, you know, it is a Black community because slavery has ended in 1865, is still thriving. Judith Wellman has that beautiful chapter in her book, The Promised Land, about where Weeksville was at between 1880 and 1910, right? Sort of that Gilded Age era. So thinking about self-determination, about the idea that Black Brooklynites have a long history of being able to build institutions and communities for themselves in a way that they needed to, because structural racism, you know, would otherwise prevent them from thriving as a community. And so I just wanted to sort of look at this image, Brooklyn Home for the Aged, and thinking about, again, institutions that sort of died, like the Colored Orphan Asylum in Manhattan post-draft riots, and the number of institutions that come over to Brooklyn. So Brooklyn Home for the Aged Colored People, thinking also of the Howard Colored Orphan Asylum, which will eventually come to Weeksville, and the types of ways in which Black Brooklynites still are community building, even in the 1890s. I'm going to leave it there because I feel as though I just want to give it a bit time to let us do questions and answers, and there's a little bit more that I think we could talk about.
Thanks, Prithi. I do want to come back to the account of the draft riots in 1863 from the Gertrude Lefferts Vanderbilt collection. But as you said, there are some important points that I want to make sure we touch on. One of the tensions going on in 1896 in Brooklyn was anxiety among native-born Americans and the Anglo-Dutch Old Brooklynites. These are the Anglo-Dutch Old Brooklynites that you've seen probably depicted in the show that we can't avoid talking about while talking about the Gilded Age. Also, the Peggy Scott character, as I understand, is sort of based as an amalgamation of Susan Smith McKinney Stewart and Ida B. Wells, two names you've heard mentioned. But these old Brooklynites feared the charter culture would soon be smothered by the influx of migrants and immigrants, particularly European immigrants who were moving in during this period of time. Can you talk a bit about European immigration, Tom? You're muted, I'm sorry.
This is a period when you have an enormous influx of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. Previously, a lot of immigrants, the majority of immigrants had come from Ireland, for example, and Germany and the Scandinavian countries. So certainly Brooklyn is becoming a patchwork of, and will continue to be a patchwork of ethnic neighborhoods, right? It's often forgotten that Sunset Park and Bay Ridge became predominantly Scandinavian communities, and it were like Sunset Park was primarily Swedish until the Gowanus Expressway basically blew that to pieces. And I even remember when I was in high school in Bay Ridge in the 80s, there was still a trace of Norwegian presence there. The Norwegian newspaper was still being published. But primarily in this decade, you had people coming from Eastern and Southern Europe, including much of my family. And they were not welcomed with open arms, to put it somewhat mildly. The Anglo-Dutch elite saw them as a threat, and really begin running away, not quite yet, but within a generation, within 20 years or so. They constitute really the first wave of white flight out of the city, out of Brooklyn, to places like Riverdale, Scarsdale, Tuxedo Park, the North Shore of Long Island, and other suburban communities. And they are fleeing the influx of these alien others, as they would put it. And just the way that in the post-World War II period, these people, right, the children of the Eastern and Southern European immigrants themselves will flee in the face of advancing migration of African Americans from the South during the third wave of the Great Migration, and after 1965, immigration from abroad.
Tom, this too leads me to, I think, two different important questions. One is about consolidation, of course, happened in 1898, a mere 2 years from when we are setting the scene, when Brooklyn was sort of at the apogee of its self-determined independence, right? It was a still independent city until 1898. And some of this racism and xenophobia that you're alluding to was embedded in the rhetoric that Brooklynites had against consolidation, right? Can you talk some more about that?
Well, but that's because the main point of arrival, the main place where immigrants were pouring into to sort of get a foothold in this new country was the Lower East Side, and the Lower East Side was infamous for its horrific overcrowding, its unsanitary conditions. It had very high rates of all sorts of disease, infant mortality, and it was a place where these immigrants coming from other countries, these alien others, were concentrated and congregating. So the idea of joining with that place, right, was frightening to this and you know, unsettling to this old guard.
Brooklynites were overwhelmingly against consolidation. Is that right?
It was, as I understand it, it was very controversial. It passed by a very narrow margin, but then there were numerous reasons why it made sense. The Brooklyn it had enormous debt. It also needed water from the Croton system, and there were other reasons. But the old guard was against it. That's for sure. The Anglo-Dutch elite certainly did not want to meld with this great, you know, immigrant processing machine across the river.
And that was the next question that I wanted to touch on is, how did life in Brooklyn at this time differ from life in Manhattan? And I think too, Prithi, you alluded to the site of trauma, right, that many Black Manhattanites who eventually fled to Brooklyn experienced after the draft riots in 1863. Is this a good time to go to the manuscript from the Gertrude Lefferts Vanderbilt collection?
Sure, absolutely. I think it's almost the last slide, and it's the written. I think it's the last slide in the presentation.
Very last one, yeah. And that one, I was really interested in hearing you talk about why you had me select it from the materials.
Sure. So just to set you up while the presentation comes back up, it's taken from the Gertrude Lefferts Vanderbilt collection at Center for Brooklyn History. And I've always sort of returned to it. So Gertrude Lefferts Vanderbilt is writing this much later. She's writing this in the late 19th century, but she's talking about, as a white woman, right, as sort of the sort of elite Dutch descendants. She's talking about what happened during the draft riots in 1863. And I think what I always sort of return to, and other historians have picked up on this, is this notion that even, you know, slavery has been dead in New York since 1827, and it's been, you know, sort of eradicated by 1865. Even in the late 19th century, a woman like Gertrude Lefferts Vanderbilt is really holding on to this like last hurrah in terms of her status in society, and in which enslaved people, or certainly people of African descent, in her view or in her world, are playing a really passive role, one in which she plays one of almost like, you know, the white savior or maternal character. And so she's talking about this point in history that is deeply traumatic, right? That is deeply violent in New York City's history. But she talks about it in which she quite rightly positions Brooklyn as a place of safety and refuge, which indeed during those horrific days in July 1863 it was. We have evidence that people were coming across the East River. They were going up to the Turnverein Center in Williamsburg, right at German Hall. They were coming out to Flatbush because Flatbush was far enough away from the East River. And so I just always find it sort of intriguing that Gertrude Lefferts Vanderbilt takes it upon herself to kind of put her stamp on history, and in which, you know, the quote says it all, but it talks so much about, well, you know, if these people of African descent hadn't been so excitable, and, you know, if we'd only sort of educated them the right way, or if only if we had done this, and in which these sort of racist views, I think, of course, will have a legacy, but in which I think this sort of Dutch descendants realize the game is up, right? The jig is up, and that actually society is changing considerably by 1896. And those kinds of relations that made Brooklyn what it was, right? Slavery was the backbone of Brooklyn, are having to be addressed. and that the 20th century is fast around the corner. So consolidation is fast around the corner. And that way of life, you know, certainly Flatbush, New Lots, New Utrecht, which had held on to agricultural sort of land and an agrarian economy as long as it could, that was also coming to an end. Exactly as Tom set us up at the beginning, all of that map of Brooklyn was about to be developed. So I sort of love coming back to Gertrude Lefferts Vanderbilt, not because I, you know, sort of admire this woman in any way, but just to sort of really indicate that Brooklyn was at a turning point in 1896, and somebody like a Gertrude Lefferts Vanderbilt sort of realized that I think her family's history and the way in which they had lived their lives was going to change dramatically as they turned into the 20th century.
Thank you, Prithi. I do have some questions that have come in from the audience. I don't know that we, I think this is a good time to ask one. Here's a straightforward question. Prithi, can you tell us exactly where Weeksville was on the map?
Yeah,
and why
absolutely.
it no longer exists?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yes. So twofold. Weeksville, in terms of your streets, are Fulton, East New York Avenue, Ralph, and Troy, right? Those are the four boundaries. Why it no longer exists? Well, in 1896, it did exist. By the 1920s, 1930s, it no longer exists because, exactly as Tom had set up, Brooklyn is changing, right? You have the emerging neighborhoods of Crown Heights and Bedford-Stuyvesant. Weeksville, if you know those Hunterfly roadhouses, are off the grid. So as that grid is being put in place, as that railroad is coming in, and I would also argue politically, there may not have been that much of a need for Weeksville anymore. Weeksville was founded on the premise of owning property in order to be able to vote. It was very much founded as a political act. By the 1920s, Black families have other options in which to move. And not to say that the Black vote was necessarily secured by the 1920s, but that Brooklyn as a whole was changing. You know, Carla Peterson talks beautifully about sort of Black families living up in Williamsburg and thriving there. So Black Brooklynites had other options in which to live, which kind of makes the need for Weeksville disappear slightly, the sort of immediate need for it. And it also just dilutes the community of Weeksville.
Thank you. Question from Annette. Can we mention the presence of Native Americans in Brooklyn? Were any Indian nations living in or near Brooklyn?
Certainly. I mean, for at least 1,000 years, we know that there were Lenape settlements along the Brooklyn shore. It's the reason about 1,000 years or so is around the time that the modern shoreline settled into place after sea level rise stabilized, right? So after the glaciers retreated, you know, the sea levels were way lower than they are now. The coastline of New York, the shoreline was about 30 or 40 miles further out than it is today. And as all that ice continued to melt, sea levels rose on the modern shoreline. So we know that stabilized around maybe 1,200 years ago. There's plenty of evidence of Native American habitation, especially in the southern parts of Brooklyn and the deep South Brooklyn, as I call it. There were major, at first seasonal settlements, but later on they became permanent. They really became embedded, ironically or paradoxically, as the triangle trade evolved with the arrival of the Dutch, and then of course the British continued in, and the triangle trade involved the securing pelts, beaver pelts from the northern Algonquin tribes, trading them for wampum that was being produced by the Lenape in places like Garrettson, along the Garrettson Creek and other places in southern Brooklyn. So that's what really created a concentration there, a year-round settlement. We can see this change by studying, archaeologists have studied the burial practices. So suddenly you've got evidence of a year-round settlement. Just to finish answering this question, I'm sorry I'm going on, but the Native American presence in Brooklyn vanishes very, very early on. The European diseases decimate the population, and there are lamentations on the part, somewhat ironic, on the part of English visitors or settlers, even in the late 17th century, noting that the Lenape are gone, basically. And it's just trace remnants of the community after that.
Tom, I believe you mentioned in your book, and correct me if I'm wrong, that one of the last native-born Lenape living in Brooklyn dies in 1830. Is that
I
year?
think that's right. That sounds right. I have my book here, but it'll take me a while to dig that up.
Devastatingly early.
Yeah, pretty early. Yeah.
Thank you for that. We have a question from Eileen about Reconstruction. Prithi, when it was revoked throughout the South, did that affect Black communities in Brooklyn as well?
Yes, is the short answer. Reconstruction, 1866 to 1877, affects Black communities in two ways. Black communities, again, Black Brooklynites, along with Black New Yorkers, if you're thinking about those living in Manhattan, are at the center of organizing for all of those newly emancipated people that will come up. There are women such as Mary Wilson, Elizabeth Gloucester, who are going down to the South to teach in those schools, or they're fundraising right here in Brooklyn in order to buy supplies, create resources for families that are moving here. We know from Weeksville and the decades of research that those staff and team members and researchers have done, that there was the newspaper, right? Newspaper welcoming people from the South to the North. And there's a beautiful sort of alphabet in the Freedmen's Torchlight that indicates that Weeksville was very welcoming of their new neighbors, their brothers and sisters that had been newly emancipated. So yes, Reconstruction affected Black Brooklynites in a way that they were both at the center for organizing, but also that the demographics of Brooklyn, again, were changing as more people moved from the South to the North.
There's also a question. There's a question about segregation in libraries during the early years, which I'm happy to speak a little bit to, or certainly less than happy, as libraries certainly have this have a reputation as the last democratic space, a bastion of true neutrality. And of course, librarians have become increasingly critical of this rhetoric, particularly over the past decade or so, and embracing their role in creating sanctuary for the homeless, impoverished, undocumented, and providing safety from violence and oppression. We've really sort of expanded our roles, but in the South and the North, particularly, libraries were not always this kind of space. There was, in fact, segregation, particularly in Jim Crow South, and certainly before that. And one of the pieces that I will share in the chat with everyone is about fugitive libraries, which were created, another sort of self-determined library that was an antecedent of a bookmobile that went into communities to provide library services where they were not provided on site to the people who were segregated and prevented from coming into library doors. Let's see.
I was just, I don't know if you want us to be answering there's a lot of questions coming up here, and I was just answering a couple on text using the chat. I don't know if you want us to continue to do that or not, but
if there's a question that you're particularly interested in addressing to the wider room, so to speak, please.
Yeah. Let me just go back and see here. The one person mentions this book of cabbages in Kings County, which is not only a great title, but it's a wonderful book, and it actually, and it's a great book about the agricultural economy in Brooklyn. It's really one of the first of a fortunately large number now of scholarly works on Brooklyn. Brooklyn had until recently a real paucity of scholarship, whereas Manhattan, Jesus, Manhattan must be the most navel-gazed place on the planet. I mean, there are dozens of good scholarly books and good popular books about Manhattan, but Brooklyn kind of had a lack until, but in the last 20 years or so, and especially in the last 10 years or so, there's been a surge of really good books about on every aspect of Brooklyn. In fact, two colleagues of mine here at Cornell are publishing a book about the Anglo-Dutch era of Brooklyn history, about Protestant Brooklyn, and that will be coming out on Cornell University Press, I think, in this very soon.
I just wanted to jump in because someone in the chat asked a question about the queer scene in Brooklyn in 1896, which is a great opportunity to also center the work of Hugh Ryan, who wrote the excellent book When Brooklyn is Queer. We're talking about the surfeit of excellent scholarship on Brooklyn in 1896. Do either of you want to expand on When Brooklyn Was Queer?
It's a great book, and Hugh's a wonderful scholar, and it is a good example of the expanding scholarship that's touched many aspects of Brooklyn life, literature, and culture.
And the answer was it was thriving in Brooklyn in 1896. Truly, that's so much of what Hugh Ryan's scholarship reveals, particularly in sort of more transient spaces, right? Like along the waterfront, dock workers and vaudeville scenes. Ella Westner is a drag king that Hugh Ryan identifies as sort of an icon at the time. Sailors, of course, people working in a lot of, again, those transient capacities. So do check out When Brooklyn Was Queer if you haven't yet. We probably have time for a few more questions. What kind of cross-racial and cross-ethnic activism was happening in Brooklyn in 1896? I see you thinking.
I have no idea. Maybe Prithi knows, but I imagine, I can't imagine there was a huge amount, but maybe Prithi can answer that.
No, sorry, my facial expressions are because I'm like, there might have been. I don't know of any. Brooklyn's a strange one, and I say strange in the most loving way possible. I know when we were researching abolitionism in Brooklyn, so if you take the history of abolitionism, the whole point of when you sort of teach it at the college level or whatever level you're teaching at, is the abolitionist movement in the United States is the first time in US history that Black and white abolitionists come together, right, with common purpose to dismantle slavery and to advocate for legal and political rights for Black people. Brooklyn always does something completely different, though. So where that was the story in Boston and it's the story in Manhattan, our research never kind of showed that. That sort of cross-racial solidarity or community building happens way later in Brooklyn's history. It is really Black people at the center of the struggle, trying to figure out what democracy looks like in Brooklyn, and are constantly in dialogue with abolitionists or anti-slavery activists across the water in Manhattan. So I think my sort of puzzled look is, I don't know if that really changed by 1896. I don't have a lot of evidence to suggest that certainly those three women that I was talking about were doing sort of, you know, cross-racial or cross-ethnic activism, because the whole point about the Black women's vote was the argument that white women were leaving Black women out. So I think that was my puzzled look. I'm wondering if that's just sort of the through line of Brooklyn's certainly 19th century history. That changes, of course, in the 20th century.
Somebody asked here, any information about the origin of Asian communities in Brooklyn? I will say that I have, in researching my book, I came across a lot of accounts of Filipino communities or a Filipino community associated with and very close to the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Apparently because of the American incursion in the Philippines and the American presence there, there were a lot of Filipinos involved with the U.S. Navy, not as naval officers or even enlisted, but in staff positions and working on the ships in various capacities, chefs and cooks and in cleaning staff and all. And because of that, there was some of them settled in and around the Navy Yard, and along Sand Street, you actually had a number of Filipino restaurants and other institutions. There was also a Japanese presence on Sand Street, Japanese restaurant, at least one, a cafe of some sort. I don't know much more than that, but that's the earliest that I know of in Brooklyn.
Yeah, and I was also just going to suggest my fellow CUNY colleague, Tari Hum's work on Sunset Park, in which she does sort of set out very early on in the book some of the sort of history of Asian American presence in Brooklyn. So that would be something else to sort of look at.
There's another question here about how did the opening of the Brooklyn Bridge change Brooklyn? Well, you know what. Brooklyn,
we can't finish this without actually talking about the Brooklyn Bridge.
Yeah, and I'm going to keep it brief because, you know, the Brooklyn Bridge, you know, prior to the bridge, you had the ferries, right, of you know, made famous by Walt Whitman and others. And that really was the bit of infrastructure that fired up the development of the extensive development, residential development of Brooklyn, right? Brooklyn Heights likes to point out that, you know, that community was the first suburb in the United States. And it was, in a sense, that people were commuting there. It was a bedroom community. They were commuting on Fulton's Ferry. And then you had, you know, extensive development of that sort into the Civil War period and right after. That's the great period when all the brownstones are built. What happens with the opening of the bridge is that the floodgates are just thrown wide open, right? And that's when you really get the surge of the second surge of brownstone development, when the brownstones are now being mass produced. They're no longer, you know, these bespoke one-off, you know, townhouse mansions. They're being mass produced. And it, you know, that also is something that was that fused with the development of Prospect Park and the parkways, right? So you had push and pull factors there.
Thank you. It really rounds out the discussion of some of the major influences on Brooklynites in 1896. And I hope that everyone who attended tonight has a clearer sense of what life was like on the ground for every ilk of Brooklynite in 1896. And if you have additional questions or are interested in doing your own archival research or checking out the books of our esteemed panelists, please contact us at the Center for Brooklyn History at CBH reference at bklynlibrary.org. And thank you both, Prithi and Tom. And thank you everyone for coming.
And thank you, Michelle, and
Thank you.
thank you, Tom and Prithi. It was a really wonderful, wide-ranging conversation. I feel as if there was a lot covered and we learned a ton. I wanted to let everybody know that this has been recorded and it will be posted on the Center for Brooklyn History YouTube page tomorrow. And also that the next Out of the Box is coming up on March 31st. This one it's very different. It looks at Pete Hamill's papers, the collection of papers that Pete Hamill's widow donated to the Center for Brooklyn History. And you really get a sense by looking at some of those papers of the man, his heart, his values, his creative process. We'll be talking to his brother, Dennis Hamill, and his longtime editor, whose name is Bill Phillips. So I hope you join us for that. And thank you again for joining us tonight. And I wish you all a very good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.